Yes, you're welcome once again to our book series, Book Chat. And on Book Chat today, we have Mary Owusu. She teaches African history at Department of History at Carleton in Canada. Her research interest lies in the areas of African intellectual, political, and development histories, with a focus on Ghana, Ghana in West Africa. Ghana used to be Gold Coast. Now it's Ghana. Her current research explores the intellectual history of female intellectual thought in Gold Coast/Ghana. Her methodological approach challenges the errors and gaps in African intellectual history that presents intellectualism as an endeavor solely undertaken by a few brilliant men. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll welcome Professor Mary Owusu. Thank you very much for accepting to come on the program.
Thank you very much, Prof. Odutola, for inviting me. It
Yes.
is, it is an honor indeed to have this conversation with you. And I should also say it for the record that this is my first time since the book came out in December 2024 that I am talking with someone in depth about the book. So I'm excited.
Okay. We are also very excited because we'll be talking about a book that comes from West Africa. And the usual first question is always, there is always a story behind every book. And the question is, why this book? Why now? What is the backstory you want to tell us about the book?
So this book is simultaneously something that grew out of my teaching in Ghana. And then as a university lecturer at the University of Cape Coast, I had to teach Ghanaian intellectual history. And it brought me that closeness of selecting works for my students to read, made me realize that there weren't works dedicated specifically to intellectual history. So that was a problem. Then, secondly, in 2007, Ghana celebrated 50 years of independence. And for that celebration, the then president of Ghana, John Agyekum Kufuor, decided that the nation should celebrate heroes in every region. So he enacted a Heroes Park in every region. At that time, we had 10 regions. Now we have 16, but we had 10. So this became a debate. People started contesting this move. They asked that why would he want to celebrate heroes? Because we should celebrate one man, Kwame Nkrumah.
Mm.
And that is the end. That was also because everybody knew that the political coloring of John Agyekum Kufuor was such that in the past, his political ancestors were the main opponents of Kwame Nkrumah. So that brought this into question, and many people started saying, "Are we trying to change the history of Ghana and write something else by doing this?"
Mm. Okay. Well, there's always a reason for a book, and there's always a reason for another book about that book as well. But let's delve into the book. Your book challenges the traditional view of Ghanaian nationalism by highlighting the role of cosmopolitan thinkers. Could you elaborate what you mean by cosmopolitan in this context and how it shaped the nation building process?
Okay, so I would say that I am a why type of person. I like to ask why, and then once you answer, I'll say another why. I'm like the kind that will ask you five whys after every why. So what I thought of was, why are people contesting historical facts? Did it happen that Kwame Nkrumah led Ghana to independence? Yes. He was the main leader. His political party won. But did it also happen that these various heroes being talked about worked towards the nation building process? And the answer is yes. So, what then is the reason why we want to place one above the other or one beside the other? And what I realized was that many people referred to the works of these, for want of, I'll use the Guinean language for that, we call them the founding fathers. So these founding fathers, you could find their works. And I realized that if you looked at their works as something that occurred only in Ghana, you will be tempted to think that there is only one person, Kwame Nkrumah. If you looked at their works broadly and considered the various networks, so that's where the cosmopolitan comes in, that first of all, Ghana, like all other African countries, has a long history dating to before the 1000 ADs of interaction with the rest of the world. And a lot of times, many people who had occasion to voice out an opinion were in conversation with people in Ghana, in West Africa, in Africa, and outside, mostly across the Atlantic. So this engagement, when I was fascinated, history of ideas, before this time, a lot of people had written the history of ideas. And when you think of the history of ideas, you focus only on the ideas. What intellectual history does is that in intellectual history, we think of the people whose ideas we are studying. So when I thought about the people and their ideas, I just saw that they were influenced by the world. They were influenced by what was happening. They were influenced by the people they met. The things they spoke about was for Ghana and the world. And that fascination sent me on this journey, and for which I decided that this oxymoron, because in real sense in English, a nationalist is closed, it's not cosmopolitan, and a
Mm.
cosmopolitan is not a nationalist. So I use this oxymoronic sense of it that they were both, and there was no tension, there was no problem. They were nationalists 100%, they were cosmopolitan 100%. That's why they are cosmopolitan nationalists.
Well, um, that's an interesting concept, but one would like you to put a little bit flesh on the bone.
Mhm.
Who were some of the key transnational thinkers you discuss in the book, and how did their ideas and experiences beyond the Gold Coast influence the contributions to Ghanaian nationalism?
Okay. So I'm going to start with a common front for you and I,
Okay,
Nnamdi Azikiwe.
okay.
Nnamdi Azikiwe is in my book. He's one of my transnational thinkers in a book about intellectual history of Ghana. And it is it is definitely intentional. One, Azikiwe did come to Ghana. He did touch base in Ghana before relocating to Nigeria when he was made to. Now, I will come back to him, but in the early days, I'm thinking about the founding fathers of what became known as the Aborigines Rights Protection Society. The Aborigines Rights Protection Society, which was founded in 1897, was started by John Mensah Saba and his cohort. Now, Saba wrote a book. Saba's book came out in 1897, and that essentially begins West African intellectualism. Not, that's wrong. That is very wrong. We have preceding Saba, the history book by what's his name in Nigeria?
Would it be Ajayi, Ade Ajayi?
Ajayi, yes.
Okay.
Ajayi, the Ajayi, and not Ade Ajayi, but
Oh,
the
okay.
Ajayi,
Ajayi. Okay.
the Ajayi, the older Crowder. Is it Samuel Crowder?
Ajayi Crowder.
Yeah, yeah.
Samuel Ajayi Crowder.
As
Okay.
Samuel Ajayi Crowder's works. You have those works, but that engagement, his was a history. He wrote about a history, but Saba writes a work that says, here is Fanti. Then the nation to him was Fanti,
Mm,
the Gold Coast colony Fanti people. Here is Fanti custom. And here is how, like India, that's what I'm talking about when I say when you put intellectual history, when you think intellectual history, I think in context. So when you put their works in the world, the Indian revolt had taken place, and in India, the British were there. The British were colonizers in India and colonizers on the Gold Coast. In India, they had come to the realization that they would have to effectively rule through Indian customs. So Saba writes a book and says, here is Fanti customs, which we can use to make laws for Fanti people, and
mm,
which we can use to get effective government. So you have these, if you look at the work of Saba alone as something that he wrote for Ghanaian or the Gold Coasters, then people like Ade Ajayi will look at his work and say, this is a work of a cultural nationalist. But if you
mm,
understand that Saba was writing in relation to what had happened in India, then you see beyond the cultural nationalism, his quest for effective governance in the Gold Coast. So that is why I like to broaden their works as cosmopolitan, engaging with the world and also engaging with what is inside. Now, I've spent a lot of time on Saba. Let me mention Saba again. Saba's friend that he wrote to the exchange letters was one of the prolific explorers and writers of their day, Mary Kingsley. They will exchange letters, and Mary Kingsley will say, hi, Miss Saba, I like what you wrote over here. And then he will also say, yes, the last time we spoke, when we met in London, when we discussed this, this is what it says. You have people like Edward Wilmot Blyden. He will go for walks in parks with Mary Kingsley, and they will write to each other. Then you will have in the US, if you remember, in the US, there was this big debate between Du Bois
mm,
and Booker T. Washington.
mm,
If you come to the Gold Coast, when Saba writes his book, Booker T. Washington writes to him and says, hey, Mr. Saba, I love what you wrote about this. Now you have made us see in real terms what the customs of Africans are. Then, when he and Du Bois have their 10-year debate about industrial education or talented 10, you find the Gold Coast writers to writing and
mm,
telling Du Bois, no, Mr. Du Bois, you are wrong. Here we are with Booker T. Washington. Same happens in a place like South Africa, although I don't mention it. South Africans take this debate and they use it to formulate their ideas about what education is good for South Africa. So we have a sense in which in the 19th and 20th centuries, people are conversing across the globe. But I see in Ghana where when we limit the conversations, so for example, Nnamdi, whom I mentioned earlier, Nnamdi's work is a work that people see as is a nationalist work. It is this, but it is also a work that is straight up his Ghanaian experience. Nnamdi writes in his work, and if you're reading it from the vantage point of knowing that he lived in Ghana, then you would see that his book is about a person like J.B. Dankwa, who comes up later on. He says some people are like are young, but their mind is old. And some people are old, but their mind
Their
is
minds
young.
are
He's
young.
referring to JB Dankwa because JB Dankwa, he writes something and JB responds and gives a lesson about chieftaincy. And Inamdi responds to this in his book and says, look at this young man thinking
Mm,
old. And Inamdi also inspired, he brought a revolution in the Gold Coast newspapers. He inspired ways of thinking. He was the first, and later on, Wallace Johnson would join him to let Gold Coasters think creatively about socialist ideas. Now,
mm,
he had stopped in Britain and they had experienced at this time, you have all of them having British liberal socialism as the background of what they are thinking. And so he sees the British liberals. Later on, they will win in 1945, and you have the Labour, they become the Labour Party. But their engagement with these British liberals makes them see the sense in which some of these ideas can work for us. And so, for me, if you go beyond the national boundaries into the cosmopolitan and you ask yourself, who is this author talking to?
mm.
Then you will discover fully what they meant, not what you want them to say.
Right, right. No, there's no way in which the history of Nigeria will be written, and there will be no mention of the crisscross between Nigeria and Ghana. Even Fela Anikulapo had to cross to Ghana at some point. Even the most recent Burna Boy also had to cross to Ghana at some point. So there's always, I think we probably will call it the Ghana factor in Nigeria's history. But let's leave the Ghana factor for a while. I know that Nnamdi Azikwe had the West African pilot, which actually showed that he was a very transnational thinker. But how did the interplay between the local identities and broader Pan-African or global influences shape the development of Ghanaian nationalism?
So, for almost everybody whom we can think of in West Africa as a nationalist,
Mm.
whether you are talking Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, there was a point in 1939 when Ethiopia is invaded that changed the spectrum for everyone. And so when you think about it this way, then you see that nationalist agenda and nationalist ideals were actually married to global issues. So from 39, you see those students who formed WASU in Britain
Yes.
going out with placards, and you have them from everywhere. In West Africa, they are from everywhere in West Africa, and they do it together. And they will found WASU as West African students. And so there's that collective thing. So the Pan-African agenda, yes, occurs with the Pan-Africanist conferences of the 1900s. But there is this moment in time too, where West Africans saw themselves as West Africans, where Southern Africans saw themselves as Southern Africans, all of them. So those of us who were ruled by the British had the tendency to see our life intertwined, which is why what happens in India will inspire certain things here. Again, what happens in the Caribbean will inspire certain things. When Ghana gets independence in 1957, you have everybody coming in. Marcus Garvey, Ralph Bunche, everybody is coming in. Fanon, everybody comes in. Why? Because everybody could locate their story in that story. So there is this broader West African field that inspires everybody. And there is
Mm.
this broader world field. I think of it as transatlantic connections
Mm.
that inspires everybody. together.
Hmm. Well, the question we will still ask before we go is your definition of Pan-Africanism, your definition of nationalism, because yes, some scholars believe that Africans have state nations and not nation states because the states preceded the nation, and that forever most of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious state nations or nation states in West Africa are still struggling with the whole concept of nationhood. But let me quickly just top that. Your book focuses on the period before Ghana's independence.
Yes.
How did the ideas and debates discussed in your book influence the trajectory of Ghana after independence?
So I'll say this. If you think broadly about these thinkers, the ARPS cohort, John Mensah Saba, all the way to J.W. de Graaf Johnson, their era would be up to from the 1890s all the way to the 1920s. These people were thinking about effective government, and their effective government was effective colonial government. They were thinking, how can we make the colonial administration more effective? How can we make it serve us? So they had this focus on that. Then after them, you have those from the 30s through to the 50s, whose works would also be the same. Now, when they were thinking about effective government up to 1945, up to 1950, 51, they were thinking about how do you merge us, what we know, chieftaincy, our customs, with what the world is offering. Synthesis. That was what they were looking at synthesizing. But from 1951, when Kwame Nkrumah's CPP, Convention People's Party, takes over, in fact, the Convention People's Party starts in 1949, identifies with this same ideal to get a kind of government that merges chieftaincy with everything. But by 1956, when the last election, the Convention People's Party changes the whole conversation. And now we enter into the terrain of independence with a governance system that explicitly decided to divorce itself from chieftaincy. So that we decided from that period to take Western tenets alone as our structure for governance. So these debates that go on, they are influential, but by the time we get independence, we 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 have had the debate to an extent where the conversation had agreed that we are going to take European forms of governance, marry it with American systems, and produce something that is what we will use, but that has nothing to do with our chieftaincy system.
Hmm. Well, would you say that that decision has served us up till now? Remember, seek ye first the political kingdom, and all other things will be added unto you. And I don't think anything apart from hardship and pain has been added on to most Africans that sought the flag independence.
Yeah.
So, what's your take on using with the benefit of history, looking and projecting into the contemporary? What would you say is the situation on the continent,
I will
West
say
Africa?
that the question Saba was answering is the question a political scientist in Ghana, a historian we are answering today. We are still ongoing search for good governance.
Mm,
What is effective? What will work for us? You have in Ghana parliamentarians who run for office not once based on laws they have passed or they want to pass.
Mm,
but they ran for office based on development projects they plan to do or they have done.
mm.
That tells you the system we are using, we still don't understand.
I think so
And
too.
that is the problem. So for me, today, the new president we had sworn in January has inaugurated a new group to relook our constitution.
Mhm.
But I feel they have failed even before they have started.
Wow.
If they do not think about the structure, the kind of deep intellectual and cerebral process that these past thinkers took. They sat down, they thought about it. How can we merge? We need to do it
Mm,
because chieftaincy, at the time of independence, when we talked about the political kingdom, everybody at that time in history, because of modernization theory, everybody thought that chieftaincy has ended. It is dead. It is
mm.
still alive. We still revere the chiefs.
Yes, we do.
We have a system that is existing in local governance with our national system. It is an uneasy system. Nothing is working. Will we be courageous enough to say, let's go back, pick up these past thinkers, and use their works as the starting point for
Mm.
the future?
Like my friend would always say, maybe the future is in the past. We just have to look for it. But before we round it all up, there's always that question that is always burning. And it's, yes, you wrote the book, you know about it. What courses in the West, or maybe even in Africa, do you think that this book can be located? Is it in history or in political science, or where do you think that this can be very useful as a resource for teachers?
So for me, writing this book, I thought I was making an intervention in historiography and pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote it explicitly because I felt that the textbooks that we had gave the wrong information. We do not our memory making is flawed. We do not think Nnamdi Azikiwe is important to our historical development because we do not know he even existed in Ghana. We
Mm,
think he's somebody that came from Nigeria. I mean, that is important to the Nigerian story. Again, we do not find women in our story. Why? Because we are thinking about nationalism as anti-colonial. But if we think of the nationalism process as a nation building process, then in 1947, we will recognize Susanna Oforiatta, the first female doctor of Ghana, who not only is just an interesting figure, but she shaped the writing of medicine.
mm,
She shaped public health because Ghana, through her, gifted the word kwashiorkor,
mm-hmm,
the word for malnutrition, to the world.
mm,
We have Letitia Obeng, who in 1964 returned to Ghana with a PhD and intervened in our riverine history forever. She, I would say, is an African response to global vulnerabilities. She was able to formulate a thinking in the 1960s about sustainable development.
mm.
She's not really mentioned. She's an interesting figure. She's not studied as an intellectual who had something to offer. So now what I'm doing is uncovering these female intellectuals who were born in the early 1900s and whose works served the nation. I am looking at it as beyond, that's where you read earlier, beyond the male-centered narratives and
Mm-hmm.
beyond the text-centric narratives. That
Mm,
when we move beyond the text, then we will be looking at and uncovering these women and more than women, musicians, People, there's a man, Ephraim, in 1938, before Nkrumah could dream that we could have independence, if he's the only person we are talking about. In 1938, Ephraim brought a song that is our de facto national anthem, Yanara Assassini. If you, it is a song in one of the Ghanaian languages, Tree. This song is our national anthem,
Mm.
more so than any other song. And at that time, he talks about how the blood and toil of our fathers gave us our nation in 1938.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
So these people are left out. We have people like Amato, Ralph Amato, who is the only Ghanaian to have ever been selected for a Nobel Prize. He did not win,
Mm-hmm.
but he's a Ghanaian who existed in then. And since him, there's no one, but we
Mm.
don't know him. So for me, my thinking is expanding history, expanding the methodology so that we think more expansively about how we write history and how we choose to remember past actors.
Mm. Well, I wish my friend who wrote the women's book, Tayo Afolabi, who wrote Emerging from the Margins, were still alive. We would have had some kind of discussion between both of you, how you have gone in to the archives, because I guess you had to use a lot of archival materials for the reconstruction of this kind of history that you're talking about. But Taya is no more, but you are with us, and we're going to, as many times as possible, try and talk about your book and see how we can deconstruct history as a history of the big men and the winners and the warriors. That there are other people who also contributed to history in West Africa. So it's on that note, Prof, that I would like to say a very big thank you to you for coming and talking about your book. And we hope that many more people will go out there, get a copy, and let's engage in this. Because one of the good things is that in those days, there were intellectual dialogues, give and take. I don't know how we're going to rescue some of those material that now exist in emails. I don't know whether the young men, the Gen Zs of these days, will save their emails, or those before them will save their emails so that historians like you can have access to it. Well, thank you very much, and I hope that sometime we'll call upon you again to tell us a little bit more about all of these people that contributed to the history of Ghana. Thank you very much, Professor Owusu.
Thank you so much. I am greatly honored that you found my work interesting enough to invite me here. Thank you.
Thank you.